Dune by Denis Villeneuve was recently released, and I have been excited to see it for a really long time. Partially because Dune actually has quite a history when it comes to film adaptation. I'm going to talk about Dune's history in film a lot, so if you're only interested in hearing me talk about the 2021 movie, then you can skip to that section of the video using the time codes in the description. Personally, I think context is important, so let's move on. Frank Herbert's 1965 novel was originally going to be adapted by Alejandro Jodorowsky. If you don't know who this guy is, he was the director of The Holy Mountain, probably the weirdest movie I have ever seen. This guy is kind of a crazy person, and his original vision for the movie was also insane.
Castle. Open the mouth, the spaceship came in the tongue.
Orson Welles, director and star of Citizen Kane, was going to play the villain.
If you do the picture, even if we pay what you want as an actor, I will hire the chef of the restaurant and you will eat as here every day. I can say, I do it.
Quite honestly, I probably would have loved the movie for that alone. Pink Floyd was going to do the music, and a lot of the design work and storyboards were done by H.R. Geiger. If you don't know who that is, he designed the Xenomorph. Now I know for a fact that if Jodorowsky's Dune was released, it would have been one of the most influential science fiction movies ever. I know this because it wasn't released and it's still one of the most influential science fiction movies ever. The Xenomorph was actually originally intended for Dune, and it's pretty much confirmed that the long and broken shot at the beginning of Contact was taken from Dune's storyboards. And it's rumored that a lot of the visuals and ideas from Star Wars, Terminator, and Blade Runner were also from Dune. If you're interested in learning more about this, there's a pretty great documentary from 2014. Jodorowsky is a pretty interesting guy, and hearing him explain why exactly this project fell apart is pretty entertaining. Basically, the movie was so ambitious and ahead of its time that it was never made. Until it was in 1984. But it wasn't made by this confirmed crazy weirdo filmmaker. No. It was made by this confirmed crazy weirdo filmmaker.
He can do it. He's the only one in this moment who can do it that, and he will do it. I suffer because it was my dream. Another person will do that maybe better than me. And then when the picture, they will show the picture here, I say I will not go to see that because I will die. Even I think I will cry and start to see the picture step by step, step by step, step by step. I became happy because the picture was awful.
We come for you! What the hell?
This movie is bad. And I'm a big fan of David Lynch. He's made a few of my favorite movies of all time. I mean, Eraserhead? That's my jam. And David Lynch is unintentionally one of the funniest people on the face of the planet.
Go. Funny. 3, 2, 1.
There is a YouTube video of him making quinoa for 20 minutes, and it's genuinely one of the most riveting things I've ever seen in my life.
Moths were flipping and flying and like frogs. Frog moths were pulling themselves out of the earth and flying up in front of the stand.
My point is I love this guy, but I'm not sure if he was the right pick to tackle his story. I'm honestly not so sure that David Lynch is the right person to tackle any big budget blockbuster. I mean, this was his reaction when he was offered to direct Return of the Jedi.
And I came into an office and there was George. And he talked with me for a little bit and then he said, I want to show you something. Now, right about in this time, I started getting a little bit of a headache. And he showed me these things called Wookiees. And now this headache is getting stronger.
Although he wasn't given much creative freedom anyways, so I guess we'll never really know.
It's not David Lynch, because he is a big artist. He's the producer who did that.
One of the sad things about this picture is that it doesn't give you any entertainment, even on the level of looking at the special effects and the wonderful things happening on the screen.
They're quite cheap, actually.
They're not that. There are scenes that look like those high school pictures you see where some kid has a plastic airplane going across in front of his mother's bedspread, and you're thinking, this cost $45 million?
The special effects suck, and while you're watching it, you have no clue who anybody is or what the hell is even happening. And that's kind of an issue. Audiences didn't get it, critics didn't like it, and fans of the book didn't think it was a very good adaptation of Dune at all. And after a similar reaction was elicited from the miniseries Dune, there was a desire for a definitive version of this story to be adapted to film, Which brings us to this guy. Denis Villeneuve is one of my favorite directors, and when it comes to expectations for movies, I personally think the best way to gauge their quality in advance is by the director. And whoo boy does this guy have an amazing track record. He made one movie every year for 5 years, and they're all great. Enemy proved to me that this guy doesn't pander or dumb down his ideas to appease an audience. While this movie isn't perfect, the way it intelligently presents subtext is amazing. Arrival is a movie that proves that the science fiction genre doesn't have to be what it's been reduced to in recent years. Apparently, science fiction movies can have characters and themes. Who knew? And Blade Runner 2049 proved that he could take a previously told story and not only do it justice, but improve upon it, and do something interesting with the ideas presented. The movie is one of the most technically impressive films I've ever seen and is easily one of the best sequels ever. So when I learned that this guy would be making Dune, I was obviously very excited. However, I want to make it clear that I didn't want or expect to see Jodorowsky's Dune. As much as I would have loved to see that movie, I want and trust Denis Villeneuve to do his own thing. I expected to see a large-scale blockbuster that is visually impressive and doesn't dumb things down for its audience, and I think that's exactly what I got. This movie is basically the first half of a large-scale science fiction epic, and I had a blast watching it. I think the biggest compliment I can give it is that it's more than 2.5 hours long, and it flew by because I was entertained and impressed from start to finish. Is it perfect? No, but so much of the movie was phenomenal that I didn't really mind the flaws, apart from the few moments where they took center stage, which was rare and sort of necessary, but I'll talk more about that later. I think the most important thing for me to talk about right now is that this is only part 1, which is understandably going to be unsatisfying for a lot of people, but I think it's ultimately a good thing. If the studio tried to cram this entire story into one movie, it wouldn't make any sense. And as the part 1 to a bigger story, I think it's pretty cool so far. This movie definitely prioritized the spectacle above all else, and the set pieces were amazing. The first worm encounter was genuinely one of the most exciting scenes I've ever seen in a movie, and you should try to see this movie on the biggest screen possible for that scene alone. Every technical aspect of this movie was pretty incredible. Visually, this movie is super breathtaking. Denis Villeneuve always does a really great job of establishing scale. Whenever there's something really big or really small, he always manages to put something else in frame to give you an idea of how big these things truly are. There was a lot of unsettling and interesting imagery throughout the entire movie, especially during the scenes with the villain. There were a lot of visual comparisons to Apocalypse Now in those scenes, especially with the character Colonel Kurtz. One of my favorite parts of this movie was watching the villain shovel food into his big fat stupid bald head. It was kind of what I wanted to see Orson Welles do. The costumes were consistently visually interesting and unworldly looking, and the soundtrack was pretty great too. I noticed a lot of influences from the soundtracks of Blade Runner and 2001: A Space Odyssey, and I thought that fit the movie perfectly. And there are definitely a lot of Hans Zimmer isms, but regardless, I feel like this really stands out in his catalog. Quite honestly, I think this might go down as one of my favorite scores by him. The more unsettling stuff that I thought was very reminiscent of the music during the lunar mission in 2001: A Space Odyssey did a great job of establishing the tone. The sets felt very lived in and simultaneously made the universe feel grounded and alien. The cinematography was pretty great, even though it was noticeably less interesting than Blade Runner 2049. I'm not sure if that was because the movie was mostly set in a desert or because Roger Deakins wasn't the cinematographer this time around. But either way, even if it's not as spectacular as Denis Villeneuve's last movie, it was still pretty great. The sound design was pretty incredible, even if I think it was mixed a little too loud at some points, although that might have been the theater's fault and not the movie's. Now, I've heard from multiple people who know the source material better than I do that they think that this movie was pretty perfectly cast. And while I don't know anything about the characters in the book, after seeing the movie I would have to agree with them. I felt like Jason Momoa was pretty essential to prevent this movie from feeling completely cold and sterile. He was easily the most fun and entertaining character in the movie. Josh Brolin plays a cool guy as normal. Sometimes he does an amazing job, and sometimes he's absolutely terrible. In this movie, he's pretty good. He's definitely given the worst dialogue in the entire movie, but he still has some good moments to shine. He even steals a joke from Black Dynamite.
Smile, Gurney.
I am smiling.
You know these guys with their...
Winks and smiles.
Yeah. What about the smile?
I am smiling.
If there's one thing you should take away from this video, it's that you should watch Black Dynamite immediately. Oscar Isaac was great as always. He's really becoming a favorite of mine, and while this is definitely not one of the most interesting characters he's ever played, he still performs the material exactly how he should. Rebecca Ferguson was great every time she had to show a lot of emotion, and Zendaya was barely in it. So, sorry Zendaya fans, she'll probably have a big part in the next one, but she is barely in this movie, so I don't really have much to say. And finally, I have some mixed feelings about Timothée Chalamet's performance. In some ways, I would say that the quality of his performance was great, but the way the character was written, and I assume the way he was directed, causes the character to feel kinda dull and one note for me. At a few points in the movie, I was even thinking to myself, this Paul guy is kind of an asshole. I would definitely say that this movie's biggest problem was the characters. Most of them are just not very interesting to me. The movie's other big problem is it didn't really have enough setup. It's leagues above this one, but it's still kind of a problem here. Some of the lack of exposition was great. They never had to explain Paul's powers, and you completely understood everything you needed to just by the way it was presented. I also love the fact that they don't really explain how the politics of this world function. Like, they don't show some stupid alien senate or something. It's all left to your imagination, which I think is great. Trying to avoid hand-holding in that sort of context is great, but when it's hard to understand the motives of these different groups further than get desert, cause spice, cause money, I feel like there's a problem. This isn't nearly as bad in practice as it is on paper, but it's still confusing. There are a few scenes in the movie that rely on characters to be engaging, but because the characters are so dull, they aren't that interesting. The worst example of this would be a sequence near the end of the movie. It was the only part of the movie that I think could have been trimmed a little bit, and while it's not bad or boring or unnecessary, it's still the worst part of the movie, and I feel like it's not important enough to warrant its inclusion. It's also the only part of the movie where I thought the performances were kinda bad. Like, I love Javier Bardem, and Timothée Chalamet and Rebecca Ferguson were great for the entire rest of the movie. So what happens? Because they're noticeably worse in this part of the movie. Personally, I think about 10 minutes near the end of this movie should have been moved to the start of the next one. I really couldn't care less how long the next movie is. Those 10 minutes don't really belong here. I think the ending would have been cleaner that way, and I think it would have been equally intriguing. Anyways, despite those flaws, I still think this movie was pretty great, and I think it's totally possible that some of these problems will be solved by the sequel. But, due to the current Hollywood landscape, I kind of doubt that this movie will get its part 2 if it doesn't do well at the box office. Which would suck. So give this movie money, and try to see it on the biggest screen you can find for those worm scenes. Don't watch it on your
fucking telephone. Get real.
Anyways, if I were to give it a rating out of 10, I think I'd give it an 8. Maybe a 7. No, an 8. Sure, why not? Alright. Goodbye, thank you.